Joining me is Nigel Pauley, media commentator and great friend of the show. Thank you, Nigel. Welcome to the show.
Morning,
10
Jake.
quid
You're doing a great
is
job.
quite a big jump. Is it good value,
It
the
is.
BBC?
The BBC is probably your constituents in Darwin possibly feel that they're not getting the programmes that they want to have, because the problem the BBC have is it can't compete with Netflix, it can't compete with Sky. I think the licence fee is around 45p a day, but we have to pay it. We can choose if we want to have Sky or Netflix or Amazon Prime, and we can't choose whether we have the BBC. Now, the issues we have are that about 2 million people fewer are now paying their licence than they used to, because they've had enough of the BBC. That creates a funding crisis. And even though this has gone up by, I think, up to from 159 to 169.50, which is a big jump, the BBC wanted £15. And Lucy Fraser, the East Cambridgeshire MP, who is a culture secretary, quite rightly feels that a 15% rise rather than what we have now in line with inflation is enough. The problem the BBC will have is this leaves a £90 million hole in their budgets, which are already down on previous years because the licence fee has held pretty stable. What the BBC issue is for me is the money they get, which is 3.4 billion, I think, from the licence fee, is that what they do with it. They're spending a lot of money on digital, they're spending a lot of money on management offices and on programmes, to be frank, that a lot of your constituents up in Lancashire aren't that interested in. They're not aimed at them. They're aimed for people who don't watch television, ironically, in the drive for youth. So the BBC is in a mess. And also, interestingly for me, is that the licence fee used to be arranged over 5 years, which is 5 or 6 years, which is how the BBC could plan ahead. But the government now has only left this for 2024.
But Nigel,
I know I'm old to remember when the Dean Dorries was culture secretary. Can you remember back then, Jake? I think you were around.
Yeah, I go back that far. I go back. Look, but isn't that part of the point, though, Nigel? Does Britain still need a state broadcaster, which is what the BBC effectively is?
It needs a state broadcaster, but how it's funded is the question.
Yeah.
There was a question that the Dean Dorries was going to plan, I believe. You would know more than me. In 2027, they were planning to abolish the licence fee, but whatever happened to her, she's gone. Now, I would suggest that having the BBC on a 1 year, you've got to come back next year with your begging bowl, is a way of actually reining in the BBC, because the BBC doesn't necessarily see eye to eye with this government. It never really sees eye to eye with any government. It's meant to be impartial. But there will be more control on the BBC by knowing that at the end of next year, they've got to come back and be assessed on whether we're getting value for money. And I personally think that's a good thing. I think the BBC should be assessed yearly on how their targets are. It's not good for the BBC because they can't plan ahead.
Yeah.
However, if they're planning ahead to spend millions on digital things that people in Rossendale and Darwin aren't interested in, or people in Cambridgeshire aren't interested in and doesn't affect them, then I think that's a bad thing.
Yeah, but, just going back to, you can't be right about both points. If they need to plan ahead for the next 5 years, surely they need to. Well, maybe you can, but let me try and point out to you why you're not. If they need to plan ahead for the next 5 years, some things are major investments like websites, commissioning new programs. They might want to commission a program that will run and run, but they've only got a year's worth of certainty in budget. Surely they can't do that. It can't be good that they've got to come back every year, but good that they can plan ahead, because they can't do both.
Well, I find it quite. I'll turn it back around on you, Jake. Do you think it's a good idea? Because it's your government that's imposing this. So therefore, the issue we have is most companies need to plan ahead and know what their income's going to be. Most people try to do that. They have to have predictions. We can't predict the economy, can we? Because we would have been caught up by COVID.
Apparently we completely failed to predict the economy most of the time, but that's the Office for Budget Responsibility. We haven't got time to go into that today. It sounds to me, do you think, Nigel, the BBC would be quite happy to come back in a year? There may be a change of government. If opinion polls are currently to be believed, do you think they'll get an easier time from Keir Starmer and the Labour Party?
I don't think they'll be happy to come back in a year's time. I think they'll possibly, the people who will run the BBC might be happier with, they think the Labour Party might open their purse more. But it's a question of whether there is anything in that purse. And as we all know, people are struggling.
Yeah.
And to answer your question simply, is £10.50 a lot of money to go up at this time? I personally think it is for a lot of struggling families. And I expect to see the BBC deliver something tangible for those people over the next year.
Nigel, thank you so much for joining us. That's been really interesting to hear from you.